There you go. Okay. There you go.
I can take care of that for you.
Oh, thank you. I'll keep my copy. Oh, and I forgot my pen. Okay. All right, so we're going to begin tonight a study of the book of James. And I call it an adventure in James because we're going to hopefully learn some things that we haven't learned before, discuss some things we haven't thought about before, and have an adventure as we go through the book of James. The other reason I call it an adventure is because I haven't taught an adult class in a long time, or I haven't taught a full adult class. I've filled in before, more recently, but it's been a long time since I've actually prepared and taught an adult class, and so I think I may have forgotten how to do it. So in that way, this will be an adventure for me as well as for you. So tonight what I wanted to do is just get an introduction under our belts into the book of James, and then next week we'll begin looking at the text itself more in depth, just so that we have a little bit of background. And I want to preface what I'm going to say tonight by telling you that it's all conjecture, opinion, up for discussion, because it's background, and nobody knows for sure all the background of the book of James. There's a lot of history, a lot of thoughts, a lot of good ideas about where James came from, but nobody really knows. So I have a source that I used for this, and if you disagree with it, if you have other ideas, I'd love to hear it, because that's how we all learn. Now, and just to let you know, my source is on the second page, which is an outline. I punted on the outline. I was going to make up an outline for this, and I said, no, this one's good enough. I got this from a website called Bible.org, and there was a very good article that discussed the background of James. So that's where I got most of my information from tonight, and I encourage you to go take a look at that on your own and see what they have to say. They use a lot of big words that people who study Bible history use, apparently. People like Wayne. So, but feel free to study that on your own. I listed here some class objectives, and this is just my thoughts. I think we ought to, of course, understand the principles taught in James' letter. That's the whole point of having this class. It's not just to sit in the seat and say we were here on Thursday night having class. We're actually going to try to understand what James was trying to say, the principles he was trying to teach. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to understand exactly what James was trying to teach the exact audience that he was teaching, because we don't know the exact audience he was teaching. We don't live in that time. We don't understand everything that they were going through. And so there may be specific things that he's trying to teach that we don't quite get a grasp of, but there are principles there that we can apply to us, to our situation today. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in society today. People look at the Bible and they say, well, it's so archaic, it's so old, it doesn't apply to us today. It was written to people so long ago. They were completely different, had different situations. How could we possibly make that apply to us? Well, the fact is they're right it was written a long time ago. It was written to a completely different type of people, different type of society, different problems, different circumstances, different things they had to deal with every day. But the principles are everlasting. The principles are everlasting. And you look at the history of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, thousands of years involved there, the same principles throughout, even though you had different people, different societies, different situations. And so we have the same thing here when we study the book of James. Even though we may not understand exactly what James was trying to tell the people of that time, we can find out what he's trying to tell us today, because we're his audience as well. Remember, God wrote this epistle through James. And so God had us in mind when he wrote it, as well as the people that James was writing to. So then once we understand those principles, we want to apply those principles to ourselves and to our circumstances and see what we can learn. And we want to engage in a frank discussion about what we see in the mirror of God's Word, as James talks about in James chapter 1, 23 through 25. Because if we don't engage in that frank discussion and we don't look into that mirror and understand what we're seeing, then we'll walk away and we'll forget what we saw, and we won't gain anything from it. And then we want to live up to the ideal of James 1:22. To look at that with me. James 1:22. Whoever's got it, would you mind reading that for me, Wayne?
Prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves.
Okay. So we want to be doers of the word. We want to take what we learn here and take it out with us and make it part of who we are. And be doers of the word and not hearers. That's your homework for this class. Okay? Other than just reading, and preparing for the next class. Okay, now, so that's the objectives I have. I'd like to hear from you. What do you intend to get from this class? Have I missed anything? Is there anything that you said, well, I've always wanted to study James because... So I covered it?
I think James is an incredibly relevant study, a lot of practical stuff, and a lot of things in here that hurt your feelings if you're being honest with yourself, self-reflective. That's how we grow.
That's right. That's exactly
Calvin
right.
did not like the book of James. He did not think it should be part of the
I'm
canon.
thinking of Martin Luther, but yeah.
I'm sorry, Luther.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was Martin Luther. Yes, that's right. That's right. And we'll see why as we go through the book, why Martin Luther didn't like James very much. And it was pretty much, it had to do with what he says in James 1:22, as well as some other verses in there that regard our salvation and what is required. All right. So let's get into the background. And like I said, I'm a little rusty at this, so we may finish this real quick and we'll sing some songs or something. I'm just glad that I'm among friends, and I don't feel threatened or like I really have to make this perfect. But if you have anything that you would like to add or anything you think I've missed, please raise your hand and we'll talk about it. All right, so the author of this book is found in verse 1. He says he is James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. All right? That's all the identification we get from the book itself. So the question is, which James are we talking about here? Now, the source that I used for this study points out that there are 4 Jameses that are mentioned in the New Testament. The first one is a very minor character, James, the father of Judas the Apostle. That's all we know about him, is that he's the father of Judas the Apostle in Luke 6:16 and Acts 1:13. So very probably not that James. We have the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, who's mentioned in the Matthew 10:13, Mark 3:18, Luke 6:15, and then Acts 1:13. And that's pretty much all we have about James the son of Alphaeus. There's the other apostle, James the son of Zebedee, who is also the brother of John. And he's mentioned in Matthew 4:21, Mark 1:19, Acts 1:13. And then a verse that I left out, I just realized, which is Acts chapter 12, I believe. Let's look at Acts chapter 12 and see that there's maybe a reason why this isn't the right James either. It says, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. Now this is in Acts chapter 12. This is very early in the history of the church. And so we see that James is killed by Herod at this point. So it's less likely that he is the author of this book as well. So that leaves one more James, and that is James the Lord's brother, who is mentioned by name in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3. Galatians 1:19, Paul mentions this brother of Jesus. If we look at Galatians 1:19, Paul is making the case for his apostleship and his teaching, that he is approved by God. And he says in verse 18, "Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie." All right, so here we see that James, the Lord's brother, has some prominence, because Paul went and saw him as well as Cephas. Let's look at Acts 15:13. Now this is the Council at Jerusalem when Paul went before the apostles and elders, because there were some that were preaching that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised. Okay? So here we have Paul and Barnabas make their case, and Peter makes his case, and then James, the brother of John, well, it says James. James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written." And he continues on until verse 19. He says, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God." And he continues on. So here James gets up and speaks. This would be after James, the brother of John, was killed. It could be James the son of Alphaeus, but we don't. But he was a rather minor character, so it's very probable that this is James, the brother of Jesus, that we're talking about here. All right, so all that to point out that the book of James was written by somebody who referred to himself only as James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So this was someone who would be well known by that name, by the name James. Someone who wouldn't have to necessarily identify himself in any other way than with James. And so the conjecture is that since James, James, the brother of Jesus, was a kind of a prominent figure in the church, then it's very likely that this is who wrote the Epistle of James. And so scholars seem to agree that that is the author of this book, James, the Lord's brother. All right. Anybody disagree with that? Does that seem as likely to anybody else as it does to me? All right.
If it wasn't him, we have no way of knowing.
That's right. That's right. Now, also, there are some early Christian historians that seem to attribute the book to James, the Lord's brother, as well. So, yes.
What is interesting to me is that even though what you're saying is true and he is the Lord's brother, he doesn't identify himself that way. He doesn't make these appeals to, I'm Jesus' brother and all that, look how special I am. He just calls himself a bondservant of God, literally a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that he leaves it at that.
Yeah.
And Jude, who also people think Jude is one of the Lord's brothers, he makes a similar introduction. He just says, I'm a brother of James. And a slave of God. And that leaves it at that.
Right. Because that's all that really mattered. His physical relationship to Jesus didn't matter. I found it interesting when I was reading through the material that I found that they mentioned that was one of the arguments against this being James the Lord's brother. That he never mentioned the fact that he was the Lord's brother. It's like, well, why would he? Who cares about that? That physical relationship had no meaning to anyone who would have been as spiritual as James. All right, so James was the Lord's brother. We've seen how he seemed to be somewhat of a church leader. If you take Acts 12:17, 15:13, and 21:18 to be James, the Lord's brother. I want to look one more time at Galatians 1:19 because there's something I kind of glossed over there, but I find it very interesting. And I don't know, maybe you've noticed it before, maybe you haven't. Could I have someone else read that for me? Read verses 18 through 20 again. Galatians 1:18 through 20. Whoever
Then
gets
after
there first.
3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and tarried with him 15 days. But other of the apostles saw I none, save James the Lord's brother. Now touching the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not.
Okay, thank you. So, notice what it says there about James the Lord's brother. How does it describe him?
Calls him an apostle.
Calls him an apostle. Was James the Lord's brother one of the 12 apostles? I don't remember that name occurring but twice. And one was the father of Judas, 3 times. And one was the father of Judas, one was James the son of Alphaeus, and the other was James the brother of John. Don't remember James the Lord's brother being named as an apostle. So it's curious, we always think of 12 apostles, and then one, Judas died, Matthias took his place, and then there was Paul, who was an apostle to the Gentiles. Well, what about James the Lord's brother? How does he get to be an apostle?
For that matter, how's Barnabas an apostle in Acts 14, verse 14?
Very good, right.
And I don't know, I don't have a good answer to that. I think it might help to realize the word apostle can just mean one sent. But other than that, I can just note that that's what the text says.
Right, okay. All right, and if somehow James and Barnabas did attain to the office of apostle, just like the original 12, well, who are we to question that, I guess? They would have had to meet the same criteria as Matthias did in Acts chapter 1. So, and certainly James the Lord's brother did, and we can only imagine that Barnabas did as well, because he was one of the earliest Christians. Perhaps he would have been a disciple of Christ during his life as well. All right. And then what about Paul? How did he meet those qualifications?
He saw the resurrected Lord.
That's right. And so God made him an apostle. All right. So just a fun fact for you from Galatians 1:19 about James, the Lord's brother. Now, who is James writing to? Well, again, in James 1:1, what does it say?
All tribes who are dispersed abroad.
Okay. ESV says the 12 tribes in the dispersion. What do you think he means by that? What is the dispersion, do you think? Yes.
In technical terms, the dispersion was used after the Babylonian captivity to describe the Jews who were scattered throughout the world and did not return to Jerusalem. They were called the diaspora, dispersion. Now, exactly how James intends it, whether he intends it literally to refer to only the Jews, or whether he intends it to be talking about Christians are now the spiritual Jews and they're scattered abroad, I don't know. I'm torn on that.
Right, okay. All right. Yeah, so again, this is conjecture. It is thought by some that he is actually referring to those that were dispersed from Jerusalem after the persecutions of Saul and possibly Herod in Acts 12. And so the 12 tribes would mean literal Jews, Jewish Christians that were dispersed abroad. And he was sending a letter to encourage them to continue in their faith. And so that's the thought I've gone with here in my notes. And so that leads us to the next item, which is the date of writing. Now, if that is correct, that James is talking about the dispersion of Jews, then this is very early on in the church's history. So the writing could be as early as 45 CE or AD, however you want to refer to that, which would make this the earliest epistle in our Bible, which I find interesting, that this would be such an early epistle. Some people think that it could be as late as 50 CE, but still, right around the same time period. It's not a very it's not very new, if you could call any of the epistles new. All right. So what is the message of the book of James? Well, if I had to pick out a verse, I would pick out chapter 1, verse 21. As the message that James is trying to get across to these Christians. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. I think what James is trying to tell these Christians is that they have the word in them. They have received that. They have learned it. They need to now let that affect who they are and how they live. They need to stop all the foolishness that they've allowed themselves to get into, because that is against the word that's been implanted in them. And they need to be not only hearers of the word, but doers of the word. They need to have a faith that is not just a belief, but a faith that leads to action. Okay? And he's going to, of course, get into some details on some of the specific problems that they have. But primarily, I think that is the message that he's trying to send their way. It's not enough for them to just have the word. They have to actually live it. All right, well, we have 15 minutes and not much material left to go. So I'll try to do a little bit better at timing next week. But some themes that I've pulled out as important from the book of James, and if you would like to add some, I would love to hear it. In James chapter 1, verse 12, one theme he discusses in several places is perseverance in suffering. James chapter 1, verse 12. Does somebody have that? Can somebody read that for me, please?
Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been proved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him.
Okay, all right. And you can understand that, especially if this is talking about the dispersion that happened as a result of persecution. These people have undergone trials at the hands of their persecutors, namely Saul and Herod, perhaps. And so he's telling them to hold on, keep going, persevere, even in these trials. Don't lose faith, don't lose hope, and continue to follow the Word. All right. So that leads us to the next point, which is working faith, as well as being an active hearer. Someone read James 1:22 for me, please.
But be ye doers of the word, not hearers only, deluding your own selves.
Okay. And then chapter 2, verse 18 goes hand in hand with that. Whoever has that.
Someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. I only have faith without deeds, and I will tell you my faith by what I do.
Okay. All right. So, we have to have a working faith. And we have to be not just hearers. We can't just sit and read the Bible, but we have to do what it says. All right, another theme. Chapter 2, verse 9. Someone read that for me, please.
But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors.
Okay, so James spends some time discussing prejudice, partiality, regarding some as being better than others. And we'll talk about their treatment of the rich versus the poor and how James condemns them for that. All right, going back to chapter 1, if someone would please read verses 19 through 20 for me.
Ye know this, my beloved brethren, but let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God.
Okay, so James is going to talk about maintaining peace, controlling our anger, and controlling our tongue. He spends a lot of time on controlling the tongue, which of course we all know is a big deal. So if you don't have problems controlling your tongue, more power to you. All right, and if you don't have problems controlling your anger, more power to you. So we'll talk about that. All right, let's turn over to chapter 4. Would someone please read verses 13 through 16 for me?
Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boastful is evil.
Read one more verse for me, please.
Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin.
Okay, so I've labeled this eschewing worldly pride and submitting to God's will instead. So James is going to talk about how we have all these big plans for ourselves. We think of ourselves as being in control, and as we say, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to do the other. But God may have a different plan for us, and if we don't submit to God's will, then we're going to miss it. And we've allowed our own pride to get in the way of doing what is right, as it says in verse 17. So we need to eschew worldly pride and submit to God's will instead. And then chapter 5 and verse 3. Can I have someone read that, please?
Your gold and your silver are rusted, and their rust shall be for a testimony against you, and shall eat your flesh as fire. Ye have laid up your treasure in the last days.
Okay, so this particular section, James is talking about the folly of hoarding riches that doesn't last. And I think part of what he's doing is the same thing that Jesus used to do, which is to show the people that being rich is not all that. I mean, a rich person is not somebody to be revered necessarily. This is something apparently that they were caught up in at this time. All right, and then finally chapter 5 and verse 16. Whoever has that, please read it for me.
Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much.
All right. And so he talks about the power of prayer. He continues on with that theme in the next few verses. All right. So any other themes that you know of from the book of James that you'd like to add to the list that you think I've missed? Yes, Wayne.
Well, I do think there's this thing running throughout about wisdom. There's
yes.
this battle going
Yes.
on between
I missed that.
the world's wisdom, the world's way of thinking, and God's way of doing things, God's wisdom. And it's really summed up in chapter 3, beginning in verse 13, where it says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." That would probably be my favorite passage from James, if I had to pick. It's hard to pick.
It is. It's a very rich book and very. There's not a lot of fluff there. I mean, he gets right to it and hammers home his point after point after point. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Anything else? All right. All right, well, we're not doing too bad. We only have about 6 minutes left. And so I think, just going off of this outline, which, I'm not, like I said, I got this outline from the website that's listed there, and I'm not married to it yet. But
I should hope that your wife knows that you're considering it.
it's being recorded, so I guess she'll find out.
And his sister-in-law is right.
Oh, that's right. I gotta watch myself. All right. Let's say that we go with this outline for now, and I think that next week what we'll talk about is this point number 2, enduring trials, which this author says lasts from verses 2 through 18. That's what I'm going to plan. That's what I want you to plan on discussing next time, and I'm going to take a second look at it and make sure that's really the way we need to go. But regardless, we will continue with chapter 1. I'm not planning to jump around the book. I'm planning to go through it from beginning to end. It's just a matter of how do we divide it up. And right now, this outline looks as good as anything.
Wayne said,
That's right.
Seems to ignore chapter divisions.
Yeah, which is great. Which is great. I like that. All right. Any other comments before we wrap up for today? Any questions? Yes.
So for preparing, we just read those 18 verses?
Yes. Be prepared to discuss verses 1 through 18, or 2 through 18 of chapter 1 for next week. And whatever you've learned tonight, remember James 1:22. That's your other homework. Be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Anything else? Did I see another hand? I thought I saw another hand. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up for tonight then, since I'm out of material. And we will, now, here's the other thing. I don't know, I mean, there's only, 5 chapters? I don't know how long this is going to take. Do you have a particular timeline you want me to do this within? I know.
I told everybody when we started doing these classes that, a month would suffice, but I also added to that, I'm not going to turn into like an ogre or something if you go a week over or something.
Okay, all right. So this will be about 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks. No, it'll be. No, I will try to stay within a month, but we may, as you say, we may have to go a week over or something like that as we go through and divide it up. All right. Well, if that's all, then that's all, and we will conclude class. And the rest of the kids will be out in just a few minutes.